It's the mid-1970s in California. A family is asleep in their quiet suburban home when suddenly they wake up to the sound of footsteps. Standing at the foot of the bed is a man in a ski mask. He's holding a flashlight. He's holding a gun. And in a voice colder than ice, he whispers, "Don't move." For the next 10 years, this masked figure would terrorize families all across California. He would break into homes, tie couples up, and torture them for hours before disappearing into the night. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody could stop him. Police called him the East Area Rapist. Others called him the original Night Stalker. But today we know him as the Golden State Killer. The story begins in Visalia, California, a quiet little farm town in the middle of the San Joaquin Valley. It was the mid-1970s, the kind of place where neighbors left their doors unlocked and kids played outside until the streetlights came on. At first, the police didn't think much of it. A string of small burglaries. Someone was slipping into homes at night and taking things that didn't seem to matter all that much. A handful of coins, a single earring, a few bills from a wallet. Sometimes, even stranger, he'd steal a photograph or an item of clothing, things that had no real value to anyone but the family it belonged to. But this wasn't the work of an ordinary burglar, because burglars don't usually linger. They don't take their time. They smash, they grab, they get out. This man was different. He would creep through the house for hours, rifling through drawers, laying out objects on the floor, as if he was studying his victims. For example, he'd rearrange furniture just slightly, a chair angled in the wrong direction, a picture frame moved an inch off center. Subtle things, but enough to make you stop and think, someone was in here. And the scariest part, he wanted them to know. He wasn't just stealing, he was hunting. As the months went on, his break-ins grew bolder. Entire neighborhoods in Visalia lived in fear of the man. The papers began calling him the Visalia Ransacker. Families started triple locking their doors. Some even slept with shotguns within reach. But then, suddenly, he vanished. It was 1976. 6 months after his spree began, the Visalia Ransacker disappeared without a trace. The town of Visalia slowly exhaled, thinking maybe it was over. But up north in Sacramento, a new predator appeared. One far more violent. One who would soon become one of the most notorious criminals in American history. The East Area Rapist. At first, his victims were single women. Women who lived alone, who thought they were safe in their quiet suburban homes. But soon, that wasn't enough for him. He began targeting couples. His method of attack was unlike anything police had ever seen. He would slip silently into homes late at night, usually after spending hours outside watching, memorizing the routines of the people inside. He came armed, always with a gun and a knife. Once inside, he moved like a shadow. Victims later recalled waking up to the sudden, blinding glow of a flashlight cutting across their faces. The intruder would tie up the man first, often using shoelaces he had brought with him or ones he found in the house. Then he would stack plates on the man's back and lean in close enough for him to feel his breath and would say to the husband, "If I hear these plates move, I'll kill your wife." The husband, frozen with fear, had no choice but to stay perfectly still, knowing that even the clink of porcelain could mean his wife's death. Then the masked man would drag the woman into another room. For hours, he would sexually assault her, taunting, whispering, sometimes even singing softly to himself. Meanwhile, the husband lay helpless. But the horror didn't stop there. Victims described the same strange behaviors over and over again. After the assaults, he would wander the house as if he owned it, pulling open drawers, scattering belongings across the floor. He would go into the kitchen, open the refrigerator, and casually eat food from their homes: cookies, leftover chicken, or a beer. It wasn't just about the violence. He seemed to enjoy proving that no one could stop him, that he could walk in and take whatever he wanted, whether it was food, jewelry, or their safety. By the late 1970s, more than 50 attacks were linked to this one man. The Sacramento Bee began running urgent warnings. Police issued statements telling families to lock their doors, shut their windows, and stay vigilant. But the attacks didn't stop. And then, in 1979, the crimes grew even darker. The man who had been known as the East Area Rapist crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He began to kill. In the early 1980s, the nightmare followed the highway south, leaving Sacramento. In Southern California, starting in the coastal city of Santa Barbara, couples began turning up tragically killed inside their own homes. The killer's signature was unmistakable. He broke in during the dead of night, his victims fast asleep. Just as before, he tied them up, husbands bound tightly, the familiar stack of plates balanced on their backs. But this time, there was no reprieve. After hours of torment, he executed them, sometimes with a gun, sometimes with a blunt object, always with cold precision. The brutality was staggering. Neighbors recalled the crime scenes as surreal. It was clear the East Area Rapist had transformed into something far darker. The newspapers called him the original Night Stalker. By the mid-1980s, at least 12 murders, over 50 rapes, and more than 100 burglaries were tied to this one faceless predator. Entire communities in California lived in fear of a man who seemed more like a ghost than human. Parents double-locked their doors, bought guard dogs, even slept with guns under their pillows. But none of it mattered, because no one could predict where he would strike next. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. No more murders, no more rapes. The trail went cold. Detectives were left staring at boxes of case files, stunned. For decades, his name became a ghost story in California. But years later, investigators would realize he hadn't stopped out of mercy. He hadn't disappeared because he was done killing. He stopped for one specific reason: DNA. By the mid-1980s, a quiet revolution was happening in crime labs. Forensic science was changing. In 1986, history was made when investigators solved the very first murder case using a brand new tool: DNA profiling. The Golden State Killer, who followed the news obsessively, likely read those headlines. And he understood that his reign of terror had an expiration date. If he continued killing, he would eventually be caught by his own biology. Every assault, every murder left behind microscopic evidence: skin cells, saliva, blood. He couldn't risk it anymore, and so he vanished. In those early years, DNA was still primitive. Laboratories could only test large, clean samples. The FBI eventually built a database called CODIS, a central library of DNA from convicted criminals. If a suspect was arrested, swabbed, and uploaded, his DNA could be matched in seconds. But the Golden State Killer? He had never been caught. His DNA sat frozen in evidence lockers across California. waiting for a match that never came. For decades, detectives had the killer's genetic fingerprint, but no name to attach to it. Then, everything changed. By the early 2000s, a new industry exploded: direct-to-consumer DNA testing. Companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe promised to unlock your family tree with nothing more than a cheek swab. Millions of people mailed in saliva samples, eager to trace their roots, and many of them, unknowingly, uploaded their raw genetic data onto a public genealogy site called GetMatch, where amateur sleuths and family historians could compare DNA to find long-lost relatives. And that's when investigators had a radical idea. What if, instead of searching for the killer's DNA in CODIS, they uploaded it to GetMatch? What if, instead of a direct hit, they found a cousin or a second cousin? Someone who shared enough DNA to draw a genetic map back to the killer himself. Detectives uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile, and then they got a hit. It was not the killer, but a relative. The hunt that had been frozen in time for more than 40 years had just been brought back to life. The closest match investigators found was a distant cousin, someone who shared barely 1% of DNA with the Golden State Killer. It wasn't much, but for genealogists, it was enough. From that tiny genetic breadcrumb, they began constructing an enormous family tree. They dug into every record they could find. Census reports from the 1800s, yellowing obituaries clipped from local newspapers, marriage licenses, even photographs of gravestones. Piece by piece, they built a sprawling map of thousands of people, all connected by blood. Then came the process of elimination. They began to filter the tree. The killer had to be male, white, born between 1940 and 1960. He had to have lived in California during the years of the attacks. Slowly, the sprawling family tree shrank, from thousands to hundreds, to just a handful of men. And then, one name stood out. Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer. The killer's age, build, and background matched with his. And his residences over the years matched up with the sites of attack on the map of California. But suspicion wasn't enough. They needed proof. So investigators shadowed DeAngelo. They followed him through the quiet suburbs of Sacramento. They waited patiently. Then one day, DeAngelo tossed a tissue into the trash. Another time, he touched the handle of his car door. Detectives moved in, collecting both samples carefully. The DNA was rushed to the lab. Technicians worked late into the night, comparing the discarded samples to the genetic fingerprint that had sat frozen in evidence lockers for 40 years. And then, a perfect match. The faceless phantom who had haunted California for decades finally had a name. Joseph James DeAngelo was born in 1945 in Bath, New York. On the surface, he looked like any other boy of post-war America. But behind closed doors, his childhood was far from normal. His father was abusive, his family fractured. Those who knew him later described a boy shaped by anger and control. In the late 1960s, DeAngelo joined the U.S. Navy, serving during the Vietnam War. He returned to California hardened, disciplined, but also darker. Soon after, he trained as a police officer, patrolling the very streets where he would one day terrorize. He worked in small towns like Exeter and Auburn, wearing the badge of authority while secretly studying how investigations worked, how evidence was collected, and most importantly, how criminals got away. On the outside, DeAngelo lived a double life. He got married, had children, bought a modest home in the suburbs. To neighbors, he was just another working-class man, quiet, unremarkable, a family man who fixed things around the house. But behind that mask, he was spiraling. When he was fired from the police force in 1979 for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent, few realized the chilling symbolism: tools of a predator. By night, DeAngelo transformed into something else entirely. First, the Visalia ransacker, creeping through homes and stealing trinkets. Then the East Area Rapist, terrorizing Sacramento suburbs. And finally, the original Night Stalker, murdering couples in Southern California. All the while, his wife and children slept, unaware of the monster living in their own home. When his crimes suddenly stopped in 1986, D'Angelo seemed to fade into the background of the ordinary life. He worked in a grocery warehouse. He aged quietly, mowing his lawn, tinkering in his garage. To the world, he became an invisible old man. To his neighbors in Citrus Heights, he was just Joe, the grumpy retiree who muttered under his breath. But behind that ordinary exterior lay decades of horror: 13 murders, 50 rapes, over 100 burglaries. For 40 years, he thought he had beaten the system, that his secret would die with him. But in 2018, with the click of a mouse and the miracle of forensic genealogy, the mask was ripped away. After more than 4 decades of cold case files gathering dust, the nightmare finally ended. In 2018, on a quiet suburban morning in Citrus Heights, California, Joseph James D'Angelo, once known only as the faceless Golden State Killer, was finally unmasked and arrested outside his home. Neighbors remembered him as a quiet, seemingly harmless old man. No one could have imagined the monster who had stalked their communities decades before. In the courtroom, survivors and families of his victims finally stood face to face with the man who had devastated their lives. D'Angelo entered guilty pleas to 13 counts of murder, 13 counts of kidnapping, and, through his plea deal, admitted to dozens more rapes that prosecutors couldn't formally charge due to statute of limitations. In August 2020, the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. D'Angelo received multiple consecutive and concurrent life terms, ensuring he would never walk free. Today, Joseph James D'Angelo remains behind bars. Initially incarcerated at North Kern State Prison in Delano, he was soon moved into protective custody at California State Prison Corcoran, a move to shield him from the general prison population, given the notoriety of his crimes. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any uploads. Until next time, this is Mr. Asher. Goodbye.